The Boss Hole Chronicles are brought to you by Real Good Ventures, a talent optimization firm helping organizations diagnose their most critical people and execution issues with world-class analytics. Make sure to check out all the resources in the show notes and be sure to follow us and share your feedback. Enjoy today's episode. Gather around, everybody out there in the Boss Hole Transformation Nation. This is your co-host, John Brower, welcoming you back to another episode of the Boss Hole Chronicles, joined by the remarkable and amazing partner and friend of mine, Sarah Best. Sarah, how you doing today?
Hey, John, right back at you. I'm doing great, real good. And we have fun and important stuff to share today. Excited about our guest in our episode.
No question about it. And just for everybody's benefit, this episode is a subject matter expert episode where we bring in somebody from the world of people development. And I'll tell you what, once again, I think you are going to be thrilled to meet our special guest today and all of the work that he has done and continues to do. Sarah, I'm just going to throw it right back over to you and you can introduce our guest today.
Happily. I would like to welcome to the podcast Dr. Alexander Alonso, who is the Chief Knowledge Officer of the Society for Human Resource Management, also known as SHRM. Alex, so good to see you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to be here. John, I hope Columbus is doing okay today after that university up north did something, or that team up north did something this weekend. But
no, not well. It's very overcast and sad here in Columbus, but you know, there's always tomorrow or next year.
I have a special place in my heart for the Ohio State University in some cases, just because it's the birthplace of IO psychology and where it is that IO psychologists sort of coalesced over the 1940s and 50s. So
there you go.
Yeah, what a good piece of history. Another reason to love the Ohio State University, even if they failed miserably on the football field this past weekend. But all that to say, yes, you are an IO psychologist. You have your doctorate there. You attended Florida International University.
Correct.
You've had a wealth of experiences. Let me just take a minute, if I could, Alex, and share with our listeners some of the things that have shaped your career and have definitely made great impact in the world of work trends, community building, and other things. First of all, you're an inaugural member of the Blue Ribbon Commission on Racial Equity in the Workplace. And this is a coalition that was first created to foster equitable and inclusive cultures. And I mean, it's kind of like we jump right, to one of the key pinnacles of your career. There are so many, but you have a passion, I think, a penchant for developing and helping organizations find more ways to bring inclusivity and diversity to life. You're a researcher by trade. Your work has been featured in USA Today, NBC, BBC, CNN, all these major news outlets, and you are a frequent speaker around the world and around our country too, talking about some of the amazing research you've done. And I think as I read up on you, it's very well known that your specialty is communicating data. So you find the data, you and your research team create the trends. You run a $30 million revenue stream for SHRM. Is that correct? That's
correct. Yep. Big part of my portfolio. Yep. Mm-hmm.
You are a 2007 M. Scott Myers Award. That's part of the SIOP, IO Psychology, Applied Research in the Workplace. And this is really important to know, especially given the time that we're in. You help develop federal standards for learning and developing healthcare professionals, which I'm sure came into play significantly during the last 2 to 3 years of COVID.
Oh, without question. Yeah.
Yeah. You got a presidential citation in 2009 for innovative practice through the American Psychological Association.
Correct.
And that had to do with performance management systems.
It did, in healthcare, no less, right? Because a lot of it had to do specifically with trying to teach people how to manage better within the healthcare environment. Many of the things that we know in regular organizations just die the minute you introduce the word doctor.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think many people would not be aware of that for sure. Yeah. You just have, extensive research too, and applied research around the connection between human resource management and organizational sustainability. And I think those two concepts in and of themselves, need a link, a bridge, a connection. I know that's been the focus of a lot of your work. You've written 2 books. The first was published in 2020, The Price of Pettiness. Like, oh my gosh, that's such a great title. And most recently in May of 22, Talking Taboo, Making the Most of Polarizing Topics. And I think what's so fascinating about you, I got to hear you speak a couple months back at a SHRM event, just enamored by the practical and realistic way you took these insights and kind of help people make them real in their thoughts and in their organizations. All that to say, though, you bring just a wealth of knowledge that I think anyone who's working to prevent boss holish behavior and create a more inclusive environment in their organization, one that draws from the gifts and talents of their employees, you've got some important things to say. So I want to toss it over to you to say, what are you seeing right now? What are the latest trends that you're talking about when it comes to what's happening in the workplace?
Well, I appreciate that, Sarah. And, one of the things that somebody once said to me, I'll never forget, it's a gentleman by the name of Steve Brown, who has some notoriety in the world of HR for honest HR and a variety of other things. He's the CHRO of La Rosa's in Cincinnati. And he once said to me, what I love about you is that you're busy spending time trying to get people to get out of their own way, but you also do it for organizations. It's helping organizations get out of their own way so that they don't practice the same silly things. And the only thing I could tell Steve was, what makes it interesting for me is half the time I need to be able to influence organizations to get out of their own way. And the best way to do that is with their own data or data from somewhere else. And so my view of data is really that it's a tool to help people see what they already know more often than not, right? In recent times, one of the things that we have been looking at specifically is what it is that it means to be an effective leader, and truly an effective leader when it comes to being an inclusive organization and focusing primarily on creating the types of inclusive organizations that people actually want to be a part of, right? Forget about the notion of, being compliant or being, the kind of place that's accessible, the kind of place that people understand. I want to be able to create and help people create the kind of workplaces where people just want to go, where they want to be a part of it. Right. And there's one stat that stood out to me. We collected this in 2019. And what stood out to me was there are 26% of working Americans who say that they dread going to work every day. 26% of them. And when asked why, 54% of that 26%, so really the majority, said the number one answer was my boss.
Yep.
So when you want to talk about what the biggest lever we have in the world today in terms of making workplaces better, it's that boss. And it's eliminating it, what you call, and I think it's one of the most elegant ways of putting it, eliminating boss holes, right? Holish behavior. And so for me, it really sort of honed in. And the reason I found that interesting is of that 54%, almost 92% of that 54%. So now you're talking about a whole 26% or so, right? Said right off the bat, they have looked for another job.
Yeah.
Stat that stood out to me more than anything else this year when we looked at 2022 was 41% of the workforce admits that they are looking to change jobs at some point within the next 4 weeks.
Wow.
Now, whether or not they can do it,
right,
and for a job that will actually give them what they're looking for, that's a different question. But 41, that's 2 out of every 5 people are looking to change jobs within a month.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal. We've never had anything like that. The last time we had anything to that degree was really the beginning of the tech boom in the early 2000s, right? We never really had anything like that. And then before that was in the early 60s when we saw a boom for technologies, but it was telecommunications technologies, right?
Right.
And so all that to say, when you think about the data that's out there, what strikes me is people are sending us the signal that is, I don't want to work for you. I could go work elsewhere. I hope I can go work elsewhere. How do you make my life better so that I don't have to leave, right? So that I don't want to leave. And the easy answer is to throw money at it. Everybody wants to throw money at it, right?
Right.
Everybody wishes they could throw money at it more often than not because it's a simple answer. But in reality, what we're seeing is that career advancement is what people want. They want to know that the organization cares about them and by providing them ways in which they can remain well, both emotionally, mentally, and physically. And then on top of everything else, they want to know that they're getting the kind of flexibility. And I don't mean flexibility about working at home. I mean flexibility so that I can do not only what is the mission of this organization, but the flexibility that will allow me to then take that mission and make it my own and do something more than just, my day-to-day work.
Right, right. Wow, there's a whole lot in that. Makes me think of so many different aspects of, the work that we do and why we even started the Boss Hole Chronicles. But when you think about just the sheer number, 41% you said 41% of people are seriously thinking about leaving or changing jobs in the next 4 weeks, right?
That's correct. That's as of May.
Okay. Yep. And the reason I think that is so powerful, we have a saying, is that data makes transparent all difficult decisions. But isn't it amazing though? You present that information to a business owner or a leadership group, and sometimes I think there's a moment where they say, yeah, that can't be us. There's no way that 2 out of 5 people are planning on leaving the organization. It's like, that's exactly why you have a problem with engagement or performance, because you're just not embracing the fact that this is exactly what's happening in the workplace. And to your point, if you can really hone in on that manager or supervisor, that's the key. That's the first place that they should start, for sure.
Alex, that's what you talked about when I heard you speak a couple months back. You referenced Gallup's book, It's the Manager, and talked about how, was it 62% of people managers said, I am not equipped to do this job. I don't think anybody even asked me if I wanted to, but I'm not supported. I'm not trained. 3 out of 4 of them said they could do a better job. Tell us more about that.
Well, so what was intriguing is, and you referenced Jim Clifton's book from Gallup, It's the Manager, but we actually engaged in research with them over the course of the last 3 to 5 years. And one of the things that we found was that there's a real need for more managers that are more effective, right? For instance, when you look at the number of managers that are estimated in the U.S. alone, that's 12 million people managers in the U.S. Alone, right? And of that group, you can see that there's a whole host of them that do not feel like they are equipped, meaning that their organization has provided no people management training.
Right.
In other words, they were a senior technical, great person, somebody who was a great technician, or there's somebody who was a junior manager and they've moved up into this notion of being a bigger people manager, but they haven't necessarily been given the tools needed to do that. And a lot of organizations admit they don't know what to do with it, because what they'll say is, well, I can understand what leadership training is, but I don't understand what people management training is. And there's a distinction between the two. Leadership often gets you to the point where you're doing strategy, where you're leading leaders, whereas people management is really about doing the day-to-day operational work of leading people, right? And oftentimes smaller teams, not the biggest teams, but it makes a difference. And what we learned was people managers as a whole felt like they had not been trained on how to have difficult conversations, felt as though they were not engaged in any way, shape, or form in understanding what performance meant and engaging in how to motivate the right kind of performance. And many of them did not understand feedback. And I kept banging my head when I got this data, because here we are. This was 2020, 2021. How do we not know the principles of good feedback? Right. Just about everyone is familiar with feedback. Good Lord, I come home and I get feedback from my wife all the way to my youngest dog, my puppy, on how I've failed in every way on a daily basis, right? But for some reason, we continue to see that managers don't understand or have not been given the tools to apply those things to real life management situations. And then it gets worse, because a lot of them engage in the kind of behaviors that I call the deadly sins, right? They get involved in deadly sins that are really designed to help them kind of the way I would describe it is crib notes it or cliff notes the situation, right? And so I understand what I need to do to motivate behavior, but I'm not really that confident, and all of a sudden I'm going to use some sort of cheap management trick to kind of get me to my outcome, which is out of the meeting. Unfortunately, it doesn't get me the outcome I want, though, in the long term.
That's right. It's a costly little hack, isn't it?
Yep.
And since you mentioned the 7 deadly sins, there are 7 of them, I'm aware. We probably don't have time to dig into all 7, but maybe you could name them, and then just talk a little bit about your top two. Like, what are the ones that you see happen the most often?
Oh, they range. I mean, there's so many of them, from things like practicing empathy, but not really empathy. You're practicing me-pathy, or things like my favorite one, which is just shut up and do your job, meaning I'm going to will the way to you doing your work. There's things like what I call strategy versus Feel-egy. People who try to, will their way into doing something or get people to do something based upon feel, and they make decisions based upon that. But if I was to give you my top two, my absolute top two, and I'm happy to share them all, but my absolute top two are really people who practice Diss-versity instead of diversity, right? Right now, we have this notion in the world around diversity, right? It's the most popular thing that organizations are spending on from from an ESG perspective, from an HR perspective. It's what organizations are looking to do. They want inclusion to happen. But the problem is that inclusion is a function of diversity, which is a function of making the organization feel like people can access it and that they belong in it, right? And in reality, we've learned that there are really 87 different touch points where a manager along the employee lifecycle conveys belonging and conveys this notion of, we welcome diversity and diverse perspectives, right? And more often than not, what we find is managers either kind of abdicate the responsibility and don't actually support it one way or the other, or worse yet, the ones who are really bad say the worst imaginable thing that you might imagine, right? Which is, I want people that don't look like us but think exactly like us. Right? That's diversity. That's me choosing, I'm going to build a team that thinks just like me, but has to look very different. Well, that isn't practicing true diversity. And unfortunately, what it causes is diversity without division. As a colleague of mine, Irshad Manji, likes to say, it's diversity without division, but it's because there's no investment whatsoever, right? Whereas what you're really looking for is diversity without division that's based upon people actually listening as opposed to wanting to win, right? And so if you think about the true leader, what they're trying to do, and that people manager is trying to do, is say, I'm not interested in forcing Diss-versity here. I don't want people to feel as though we're dissing their perspectives or their different identity characteristics. What I want them to feel is, I want to understand all these things, and nobody's going to win one way or the other.
Right.
We're not here to compete against each other when it comes to those factors. We're here to understand them all, and that's it. Right. And it was interesting. She shares these 5 tips. They range from everything like listening to learn to my favorite one, which is tell me more. If you really want to listen to somebody, the only question you should ever follow up with is tell me more.
That's great.
A person who remembers to say that, and a leader who remembers to say that, wins more often than not. But wins because they're actually listening. It's a little mnemonic that teaches you to say, this is what I need to do to actually listen. You're training your brain to actually listen. The other deadly sin that always strikes me is one that I talk about, and I have spoken about with Marshall Goldsmith, the famed coach or executive coach, and it's really empathy, right? Everybody talks about empathy. And there are people like my own CEO, my boss, who talks about the empathy deficit that we have in this world, right?
Yeah.
Because everybody thinks they know what empathy is and treats it like sympathy in many cases. But empathy is different. Empathy is really about understanding what somebody's going through, listening through what they're going through, and then actually offering some sort of remedy, but not a remedy for you, a remedy for them. Because in reality, what we learned is most people offer empathy really for self-serving reasons or self-serving motives. There are motives like, I want to eliminate my own guilt. I want to eliminate the problem because it's causing a problem for me that you're not performing. I want to eliminate this problem for you because at the end of the day, I'm just a fixer. That's what I do. I'm a fixer. All of those things are self-serving motives. That's what's called practicing me-pathy, meaning I'm going to give you empathy, but it's because it's helping me. Right. What happens, unfortunately, is I never check to see if it actually helped you in the long run, right? And so there's only one type of empathy that really matters, and it's that empathy that is designed to help that person for their own benefit, their own gain, not for yours. And what we find is leaders that are really good do that. Leaders that are lazy do the other ones. And that's where you get a real kind of nasty situation happening down the line.
A boss hole.
Exactly.
That's right.
Yeah. And just for all of our listeners out there, a reminder, please go to the show notes because you'll find the 7 deadly sins there and more of the resources that Alex is talking about here. So I just wanted to point that out. So let's keep going.
Well, and I love how you put these concepts into plain English. Like you kind of can't step around me-pathy. Like, oh, wow, am I doing this for that person or am I really doing this for myself? And a good check would be, did I go back and see how it worked out and see if they got what they needed? And you also talked about shut up and do your job. And if I recall, you may even have your own personal boss hole encounter with that same deadly sin. Do you care to share that with us today?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's
Okay.
well, maybe not happy to, but I'm willing to share it nonetheless. So I actually had a story. Never forget. It was a consulting that I used to do. I worked for a federal contractor that did consulting for the Department of Human Health and Services. One of the things that we were responsible for was developing better teams amongst surgical units within major surgical centers. And there's really in the United States, there's about 20 major surgical centers. And we were working with one, and I'll never forget, I was working with a particular surgeon who was being particularly difficult with one of my staff members. And my staff member was really taken aback by how difficult this surgeon was being with her. And she was really taken aback by how he was treating just everyone, including his charge nurse. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget, one of the things that struck me was I had a conversation with this person, and this person was somebody who I felt was remarkably difficult, but I got frustrated and because their behavior became wildly unprofessional. Mm-hmm. In essence, what they did was they got frustrated with me trying to teach them how to be a better communicator and better collaborator and how not to be abusive towards my staff. And so they decided that they were going to take their orange crock and throw it at me.
Oh my gosh.
Now, here's the thing. He didn't anticipate that I would actually catch it.
Oh, got it.
So he threw it at me and I caught it. And it pissed him off. Pardon my French, but it really
we speak French on this podcast. Okay. Go ahead.
So it pissed him off, and I'll never forget. At that point, I decided I was going to pull my team out. I was just frustrated with this. This is unacceptable behavior.
Absolutely.
I don't care what hospital this was, and I called my boss at the time. And suffice it to say, he's a nice man. I'm still friends with him to this day. But I called him and I said, "Listen, this is what's been going on. This is what's happened. And I'm trying to make sure that she feels comfortable continuing the work, but at the same time, I don't feel comfortable pursuing this. How do I continue to do this? Who do I talk to? Who do you talk to help us overcome this situation? And how do I make it so that this doesn't turn into an HR issue, even if it is one? But what do we do here? What's the guidance?" And I'll never forget what his guidance was. Just shut up and do your job. I don't care. Let's make the work happen. Shut up and do your job. Get back to work, and I'll see you when you get back. And click.
Oh my goodness.
That was the guidance I got. And all I can remember thinking was, okay, that was not something I ever want to do to anyone on my team.
Right.
Ever. And I made it back. And I had a conversation with him. I'll never forget. I made it back from the work. And I had a conversation with him. I said, "Do you realize what you did? You basically made it so that you said you didn't care what happened to any of us.
Yeah.
We were not as important as whatever this project is worth." And I asked him, what is the funding on this particular project? I just need to know, because he was managing the project. I wasn't. I was just a laborer on it. And he said, "Well, it's $200,000. And I said, "So you basically allowed $1 million worth of salaried staff to be abused for $200,000 worth of revenue." And what's worse is you will never be able to recover.
Right.
No one will ever believe that you care about any of us.
Right.
So what are we supposed to do now?
Put a price tag on that.
Sadly enough, he knew he was cooked. And within a year, he was gone. and he ended up coming back eventually, but he basically made his way back by being acquired. The company later acquired somewhere where he had gone to work many years later, and that reputation still holds.
Oh, of course it does. There's an old saying, old sins cast long shadows. That kind of stuff, you don't walk away from that. It follows you around for sure. Oh, that's a horrible story, but it's all too common.
Yeah, it's unbelievable how common it is. And even then, I remind people, if you just take a step back. So you got dug in. So you decided that this is what you cared about. Mm-hmm. You can recover. You can pull yourself back, but you have to consider more broadly what it is that people are experiencing. You cannot just focus on your own experience.
Right. I find that when managers and supervisors and leaders say things like that, they've become weary of some story they've been telling themselves, usually about an individual or a team. And the story is usually based on assumptions. Mm-hmm. And rather than using data like you provide to help diagnose what a challenge on a team might be or what a performance challenge might be, they've kind of gotten so acclimated to some story they've been telling themselves that they lose it one day and say something like that. Like, just shut up and do your job. Like, wow, there's nothing that says, you don't count and I don't care about you, quite like that statement. Mm-hmm. Wow. So that's powerful.
Hey, I just have one question about that whole scenario, or not so much a question, but a hope. Please tell me you kept that guy's crock.
No, I did not. I wish, but no, I did not. I ended up giving it to the lead for the department who was leading that area, who was
okay.
Actually ended up becoming a real good friend. She's now a health regulator in Edmonton, but she's a good friend. She and her husband, they're great people, and I gave her the crock. She loves it. That story still gets her, laughing every day.
Yeah, well, that was a good move on your part. Mm-hmm. Well, and you've written the second book, which I do want to spend some time talking about today, Talking Taboo. What was the impetus behind this title and the work within it, and what should we know about this book?
So what this was actually born from was a discussion that occurred between two different individuals at two different stages of my life. When I was in graduate school, I'll never forget, I had a conversation with a buddy of mine who insisted that the Elian Gonzalez approach, the way that the Department of Justice handled the pulling of the young man out of his home, mm-hmm. was the right way to go. And we got to the point where we had a discussion, and it became a physical altercation. Mm-hmm. This is a guy I went to high school with and had gone to graduate school with. His dad was my AP English teacher, and I'm still friends with him, dear friends with him today. But one of the things that struck me was we came to blows because we just didn't know what to do with how to handle this situation. And before we were talking about any topic, it became something that we had to beat each other. It wasn't about trying to understand each other's position. And it occurred to me that I didn't have the tools, even though we had been trained as good Cuban boys growing up, we had been trained to mm-hmm. understand and actually work through polemic discussion, right? Mm-hmm. It's sort of a trademark of Spanish culture and Hispanic culture that polemic discussion is something that you could do, and you could do it relatively well without it ever turning into something awful, something mm-hmm. like an altercation. And fast forward to 2020, and we had the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. And I'll never forget, I had two colleagues, Michelle and Denise, both who work in the SHRM Knowledge Center. And if you've never called the SHRM Knowledge Center, I recommend you do it. You can't beat talking to a seasoned HR professional and getting advice. Mm-hmm. But
Amen.
One of the things that stood out to me was it was late at night. They were having a conversation, and Michelle is the mother of a police officer in one of the most dangerous counties in all of Maryland, PG County. And you have Denise, who is the mother of a young daughter who had grown up in PG County and then Anne Arundel County, which is sorted by Annapolis. And they talked about what it was like to deal with police force and police brutality, if you will, in some cases. over the course of their lives and what it meant, and how perspective shifted when you became the parent of a law enforcement officer, and that it wasn't all just a black and white kind of situation. And they got heated. I mean, they really got heated, but they never got disrespectful. And at the end of the day, the conversation, actually, I came back the next couple of days trying to figure out, and I've been going back now for almost 30 days, every 30 days, just to understand how they're doing. And their relationship has improved significantly, and their work relationship has improved significantly because they got that out in the open. They had a hard conversation, but they both learned from each other, different perspectives. Not everybody sees it the same way. And they took a step forward and said, I can do my work. I can see how my opinions affect her. And I can go ahead and turn around and turn that into something productive. If they had not considered those things, I think it would be a very different situation. Well, that prompted the book. And really what it prompted was more than the book. It prompted a study. It was trying to understand what polarizing topics were in the workplace, which ones were most common, which ones were most kind of salient. And what we learned is 92% of people have been involved in this kind of discussion in the workplace. In my years of research, I have never seen anything that I believe that was 92%. I had to go back just to make sure the data said that. We did it with a different sample. And again, it was over 90% of people say they engage in these types of conversations. So fast forward to 2022, and here we are, and we've got Facebook says you can't talk about Dobbs in the workplace, and you can't talk about Roe v. Wade. And then you've got other groups saying we're not going to allow these kind of conversations. And whether you like it or not, what we're seeing is people are experiencing bias because we're trying to regulate everything, every type of discussion out of the workplace.
Right.
And I don't know about you. I have kids, I have dogs, I have all kinds of critters around me. And I will tell you this, every time I told somebody not to do something, the likelihood that they would then go and do it is much higher. Right.
When I hear that these stories, I think about civility and the ability to talk about difficult things, yet still maintain a respect and a civility, because just because our perspectives are different doesn't make you wrong. It's just such an interesting story.
It's intriguing because what we've learned is you can't regulate these things out of any workplace.
Right.
So if you can't regulate it out of any workplace, you can't make rules about it. What are you going to do? How do you help people cope with it, or at a minimum, make them do things better? And civility is an example of exactly what we're talking about. If people can't agree on something and they want to talk about it, let's make sure that they have a civil discourse about it, as opposed to a discourse that turns into some sort of disaster.
And the book Talking Taboo is really a framework for how to do that.
It's a framework for helping people do one thing, which is, if I'm a manager of these people and I see this conversation going on, I want to make sure that they think about 4 questions before they get to the end point of this type of conversation. And those 4 questions are real easy. What does this make me look like to others? What is it that others look like when they engage in these things? How is this impacting my ability to achieve the kind of work outcomes that I want to achieve? And what will I retain from having been involved in this? And by retain, I mean, what kind of things will last with me forever that I will never be able to get beyond because I've participated in this type of discussion? Again, we're not espousing the notion of eliminating these types of conversations, but get people to get out of the psychology of wanting to win or beat someone else's perspective, and get them to the point where they're thinking about, what do I look like to the rest of the world when I'm doing this? Reframing their perspective and then helping them see what this impacts along the way.
I think that's so critical right now. I know that a lot of organizations work to create, we'll call them rules of engagement for difficult conversations. And certainly there are a lot of training programs about how to have candor and how to have crucial conversations. But if we could just recognize that there is connection, even in dissenting opinions, there's an important connection that we can establish without too much pain and anguish. But it does yield results.
It can
bottom
really
line results. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah, bottom line results without question. In fact, more often than not, it's a key step towards hitting some sort of creative outcome that will result in the kind of EBITDA, the kind of things that you're interested in from your organization, right? It's that new product line. It's that ability to say, you know what, we have been so focused on all these different product lines. Let's just focus on what we should be doing, right? It's the doing less to get more. And oftentimes it's born from these types of conversations where people learn about each other, but then also focus on what it is that they should be focusing on, as opposed to focusing on just beating that person.
Yeah.
Huge.
And think about the antithesis. I mean, if we give way to stifling, constructive, and civil dialogue, it'll serve no other purpose than to divide us even further.
Well, and worse yet, what it'll do is it'll actually create a scenario where your culture will be monolithic, right?
Yes,
and
for sure.
That's the one thing that very few organizations can survive, right? I'll share the example from Google, right? There was the Google programmer who brought his red hat in one day. And yes, I do mean that red hat. And before you knew it, people claimed that he was creating a hostile workplace environment. He didn't actually say a word to anybody. And he just had it in his cubicle or his pod. And people started to say, well, this person doesn't fit. This person doesn't belong. This culture is not for this type of person. And before you knew it, this person ended up filing a lawsuit against Google, in large part because he was experiencing political affiliation bias when he didn't actually do anything. He just brought a red hat in. Now, I'm not sympathizing one way or the other.
Right.
But we shouldn't be weaponizing our cultures. And more importantly, you're wasting HR's time by doing that stuff, right? It just doesn't work. And there's more and more of that happening in the world of work.
Yeah.
Well, if you think about, I think we have well over 10,000 downloads at this point. So our followership is growing. What do they need to know as we head into 2023, Alex? And you're going to continue to research and bring the trends to the people. What's your advice? What do managers and supervisors need to be thinking about?
Well, so first and foremost, what I encourage everyone to think about is think about the fact that we've got a recession coming, right? And not to get too serious and involved in the labor trends, but what I see is for all of 2022, we had workers and potential workers really taking the lead and having the upper hand in terms of negotiating with our employer community, right? And saying this is what I need from you. These are all these things, and it's going to take a nice balancing act between the employer not pulling all those things away the minute we have a recession. And the other thing that's going to happen is it's going to take a big educational component, because a good part of our workforce has never been through a true recession, right? They don't know what an 18-month recession looks like or a year-long recession looks like, and they don't know what it is. I mean, I'll share with you just straw data, right? I've got maybe I did a straw poll of senior managers, and about 1 in 30 could really define what true inflation means.
That's it.
Really, 1 in 30. That's scary.
I mean,
that's horrifying. Oh my gosh.
Excellent advice you're providing here, though. Education. When we're dealing with significant change and crisis, education, teach, learn, help people learn things makes a ton of sense.
It really does. And more importantly, if you educate them so that they can take things and not only make it so that it's part of their day-to-day work, but more part of their day-to-day lives, meaning that they apply it all too, that's a big win. Yep. And then the other thing that I will tell people to really focus on, because I'm hoping, knock on wood, that we don't see an extended recession, right? I'm hoping that we get a little bit of a scare, we get a real recession, and things correct themselves. But the other thing I encourage people to really consider is think about how much you're spending on developing your people managers. The fact that there are 3 out of every 5 people managers that say that they've never received any kind of training. We can't expect a different result if we don't actually do something different, right?
Right.
And so I that's the other piece of advice I'll offer. And then the last thing that I will encourage everyone to think about, every single person to think about, whether you're a worker, whether you're not, is something that I learned from a colleague at Boeing who said she practices the 4 Gs. And the 4 Gs are grit, gumption, grace, and gratitude. And if you can engage in showing grit when you're up against something difficult, showing gumption when it's time to be ingenious in some way or provide some ingenuity, showing some form of grace to your others, because not everybody's going to be on the same kind of path that you're on.
Right.
That's all valuable, but gratitude gets you a very long way.
Oh, so true. And what a timely thing to share as we just, wrapped up the Thanksgiving holiday.
And just a reminder to everybody, please go to the show notes, because what you will find there are the 7 deadly sins, links to both books, The Price of Pettiness and Talking Taboo, from Alex, and his LinkedIn profile that you'll also find in the show notes.
Yeah. I'm confident that we would love to have you on the podcast again, Alex. There's so much going to be happening in the next 12 to 18 months. Just want to say thank you for taking time out of your pretty busy schedule. I know you hail from parts south of Washington, D.C., and I wish you a good winter. And just thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you all so much. It's been a real pleasure. Happy holidays. And thank you for having me on the show.
All right. We'll see you next time on the Boss Hole Chronicles.
We'd like to thank our guest today on the Boss Hole Chronicles. And if you have a Boss Hole Chronicles story of your own, please email us at mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. Once again, mystory@thebossholechronicles.com. We'll see you again soon.